What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 18th, 2026, about 8:30 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 21 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious Professor Thomas Hardy Leahey. It's a long-ass textbook. Y'all don't get mad at me because it's taken so long, but we're going to finish it up. We only have about, let's say, four more episodes left. We're going to try to end this on episode 25. So there's going to be like 25 in total. That's the goal. So we're finishing all of chapter 10 today. We're on chapter 10 today when he's talking about psychology, basically moving to America, the psychology of adaptation. We made it all the way to the rise of comparative psychology on page 294, and now we're picking up on psychological ideas in the New World. So basically, psychology coming to America, leaving Germany, leaving France, leaving the UK, and coming over to the West Side, the best side. Been an interesting book. We have how many more chapters? We have part 5. So chapter 11, that's one episode. Chapter 12, that's the second episode. 13, and then 14. So 4 more episodes, I'm telling you. Then we're done. All right, we're going to do this, and we're going to knock it out. Hopefully, we can do all of chapter 11 by tomorrow, even though it's 50 pages. Man, we're going to do it, man. We're going to do it. We're going to knock it out. We're going to get it done, man. We're going to be all right. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to pick up here. Psychological ideas in the New World, general, intellectual, and social environment. Let's go. So, America was new. Its original inhabitants were seen as savages, noble or brutish, who revealed original human nature untouched by civilization. Shout out to Siraj up in here, showing love, by the way. Shout out to Siraj. He sent some hearts. I'm going to send them back. I don't even know who you are, bro, but much love to you, man. Much love to you, and much love to everybody who shows love on this channel. Salute. Anyway, let's continue. So, America was new. Its original inhabitants were seen as savages, noble or brutish, who revealed original human nature untouched by civilization. The first settlers confidently expected to displace the Indians, replacing their primitive state with farms, villages, and churches. The wilderness found by the settlers opened up possibilities of erecting a new civilization in the New World. The Puritans came to establish a city on a hill, a perfect Christian society, an example to be looked up to by the rest of the world. In America, there was no feudal hierarchy, no established church, no ancient universities. Instead, each person could make his or her own way in the wilderness. This is not to say that the European settlers brought no intellectual baggage. They did. And 2 traditions are particularly important for psychology: evangelical religion and Enlightenment philosophy. America was initially settled by Protestants, not Catholics. In fact, when Catholics first came to America in large numbers, they were forced to remain outside the mainstream of American life. Catholics were seen as agents of a dangerous foreign power, the Pope, and anti-Catholic riots and the burning of Catholic churches were not unknown in 19th century America. What emerged most strongly from the dominant American Protestantism was evangelical Christianity. This form of Christianity has little theological content, looking instead to the practical salvation of the individual soul in an emotional conversion experience when the person accepts the will of God. An important part of the European reaction to the Newtonian spirit of the Enlightenment was Romanticism. In America, however, the reaction against the Age of Reason was a religious one. America experienced revivals in the colonial period, and another took place shortly after the French Revolution. Romanticism touched America only briefly in the Transcendental movement. Henry David Thoreau, for example, decried industry's encroachment on romantic nature. However, more important for most people was evangelical Christianity, which rejected the anti-religious skepticism of the Enlightenment. All right, Siraj says, where are you from, sir? I say at the beginning of every video, Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana. I say this at the beginning of every video. I just said it at the beginning of this one. This might be a troll comment, but it's literally the easiest question. Literally the easiest question you could ask on this channel. The rabbit hole doesn't go that deep to find the answer to that. Continuing. It was no accident that many early American psychologists, including John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, had originally planned to become preachers. The stock in trade of the evangelical preacher is conversion, playing on an audience's emotions to change people from sinners to saints, modifying both soul and behavior. The goal of many American psychologists in both the functional and behavioral periods was to modify behavior, to make the person of today into the new person of tomorrow. Evangelical preachers wrote about ways to change souls through preaching. The psychologists wrote about ways to change behavior through conditioning. Early America did possess some genuine philosophers. There was Benjamin Franklin, whose experiments on electricity were admired in Europe, who charmed France as the natural man of the New World, and who was enshrined as one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment, ranking even with Voltaire. Thomas Jefferson, another philosopher, is perhaps the best example of the geometric spirit in America. Jefferson attempted to apply numerical calculation to every subject, from crop rotation to human happiness. His Newtonian mechanism even blinded him to biological facts. Arguing against the possibility of Noah's flood, he proved from physical calculations that in any flood, the waters cannot rise more than about 50 feet above sea level, and that consequently, the fossil seashells found in America's Appalachian Mountains were just unusual rock growths. Go into the comments. Siraj says, "Sir, what do you do for a living? What is your full-time job?" I say I'm an English teacher. I literally say I'm an English teacher. I'm also a student of sociology as well, sir. It's not that hard to find. Been talking about this for years, but if you're new to the channel, you're welcome. I'm an English teacher, and if you want private English classes, holla at your boy. We can make that happen. Just send an email. Send an email over to the email in my About section. Continuing here, the more radical ideas of French naturalism, however, were offensive to America's religious temperament, and only certain moderate elements of Enlightenment thought became important in America. Foremost among these acceptable ideas were those of the Scottish Enlightenment, which in fact exerted more influence on Jefferson than is commonly supposed. As we have seen, Reed's common sense philosophy was perfectly compatible with religion. In America's religious colleges, which were the vast majority of American colleges, Scottish philosophy became the established curriculum, dominating every aspect of higher education, from ethics to psychology. Scottish philosophy was American orthodoxy. In considering the intellectual climate of the American colonies to the influences of evangelical Christianity and a moderate Enlightenment, must be added a third element, business, which interacted with the other two in important ways. America came to be a nation of business unlike any other nation on earth. There was no feudal aristocracy, no established church, and only a distant king. What remained were individual enterprise and the individual struggle to survive in confrontation with the wilderness and in competition with other businessmen. The business of America was indeed business. And slavery. Okay? Out of this unique American mix of ideas, combined with a growing national chauvinism, several important ideas emerged. One was the supreme value placed on useful knowledge. The Enlightenment certainly held that knowledge should serve human souls and should be practical rather than metaphysical. American Protestants came to think of inventions as glorifying the ingenuity of God. We're going to read that again. American Protestants came to think of inventions as glorifying the ingenuity of God in creating the clever human mind. Technology was an American word. An unfortunate consequence of this attitude was anti-intellectualism. Abstract science was scorned as something European and degenerate. What counted was practical accomplishment that at once enriched the businessman, revealed God's principles, and advanced the American dream. The businessman valued the same hard-headed common sense taught in the colleges. Common sense philosophy told the ordinary person that his or her untutored ideas were basically right, which tended to increase American anti-intellectualism, which is still a curse we're dealing with today. All right. Siraj says, "Sir, you are doing a great job. Salute to you. I appreciate that. Salute. I appreciate that so much. I work hard to try to educate the people, try to, be some light in this world to help people learn. And yeah, the anti-intellectualism in America goes deep. In the use of the term businessman, the syllable man ought to be stressed. It was the men who struggled for survival in the world of business and who valued clear-headed common sense and practical achievement. Following Rousseau, feeling and sentiment were taken to be the special sphere of women, who in the 19th century were increasingly removed from the world of work. As such, formerly domestic activities as baking, brewing, cheese making, spinning, and weaving became industrialized. This change stripped women of their earlier economic importance, leaving only the realm of the emotions to female rule. Americans also tended to be radical environmentalists, greatly preferring to believe that people's circumstances, not their genes, were the primary cause of human characteristics and achievements. They believed that, contrary to the prejudices of Europeans, the American environment was the best in the world and would produce geniuses to surpass Newton. This belief reflected the empiricism of the Enlightenment and the flexible beliefs of the businessman. There would be no bounds on the perfectibility of humans in the New World, no bounds on the achievement of the free individual. Progress was the order of the day. A cult of self-improvement dated back to the early days of the American Republic. In the 1830s, there was a monthly magazine called The Cultivator, designed to improve the soil and the mind. Not only could a man improve his farm business, but he could improve his mind as well. In fact, it was expected that the good Christian would be a successful businessman or farmer. One observer of the early American scene recognized these American trends. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America, following his visit to America during 1831 and 1832. The longer a nation is democratic, enlightened, and free, the greater will be the number of these interested promoters of scientific genius, and the more will discoveries immediately applicable to productive industry confer gain, fame, and even power. I think what Tocqueville missed is that as long as a country has slavery and free exploitable labor, of course, there will be more advancement economically. However, Tocqueville worried that in a community thus organized, the human mind may be led insensibly to the neglect of theory. Aristocracies, on the other hand, facilitate the natural impulse of the highest regions of thought. Tocqueville foresaw well. American psychology, since its founding, has neglected theory, even being openly hostile to theory at times. While Europeans such as Jean Piaget constructed grand, almost metaphysical theories, B.F. Skinner argued that theories of learning were unnecessary. Philosophical psychology. The old psychology and religion. The Puritans brought medieval faculty psychology with them to America. It perished in the early 18th century, however, when America's first great philosopher, Jonathan Edwards, born 1703 and died in 1758, read Locke. His enthusiasm for empiricism was such that his genius carried him independently in the direction of Berkeley and Hume. Like Berkeley, he denied the distinction between primary and secondary qualities and concluded that the mind knows only its perceptions, not the external world. Like Hume, he expanded the role of associations in the operation of the mind, finding, as Hume had, the contiguity, resemblance, and cause and effect are the laws of association. Finally, like Hume, he was driven towards skepticism through his recognition that generalizations about cause cannot be rationally justified, and that emotion, not reason, is the true spring of human action. Edwards, however, remained a Christian. Hume did not, and he may be regarded as more medieval than modern in this respect. Edwards' stress on emotion as the basis of religious conversion helped pave the way for the American form of romanticism and idealism, transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was a New England revolt against what had become a comfortable, stuffy, and dry form of Puritanism. The Transcendentalists wanted to return to the lively, emotional religion of Edwards' time and to the direct, passionate encounter with God that Edwards had believed. Such an attitude was compatible with both Romanticism and post-Kantian idealism. The former prized individual feeling in communion with nature, similar to Thoreau's report of an extended solitary sojourn in the wilderness in Walden. The latter believed Kant's transcendent noumena were knowable. Similarly, George Ripley, a leading transcendentalist, wrote in a letter addressed to the Congregational Church in the Purchase Street that they believe in an order of truths which transcend the sphere of the external senses. Thus, in some respects, transcendentalism was in tune with European Romanticism and idealism. In other respects, however, transcendentalism appears very American. It supported, for example, an evangelical emotional Christianity that put the individual's feelings and conscience above hierarchical authority. Ralph Waldo Emerson preached self-reliance, always an American ideal. He derided the radical empiricists as negative and poisonous. Whether European or American in tone, however, transcendentalism's effect on mainstream American thought was limited. Like Romanticism, its chief products were artistic rather than philosophical, and even its great art, such as Melville's Moby Dick, was much less popular than other works totally forgotten today. The American intellectual establishment of the colleges viewed transcendentalism, Kant, and idealism with horror, so that budding scientists and philosophers had little contact with the movement. A bulwark against any romantic revolt, Scottish common sense philosophy maintained its grip on American thought. Americans, too, began to produce faculty psychology texts at an accelerating rate as the 19th century progressed. Let's repeat that again. Americans began to produce faculty psychology texts at an accelerating rate as the 19th century progressed. American texts on psychology repeated the arguments of the Scottish moral sense theorists. For example, Thomas Upham's Elements of Mental Philosophy taught that moral character could be built through the thorough acquaintance with the emotions and passions that psychology provided. Moral sense, which Upham called conscience, was given by God to excite in us emotions of approval or emotions of disapprobation, occasioned by seeing the actions of others. To the question, why should I do right? Upham wrote that the true source of moral obligation is in the natural impulses of the human breast. Very interesting, the intellectual history of American philosophy and psychology. Basically, it's just very utilitarian, like very pragmatist, okay, very anti-intellectual, very anti-theory. And we see this in American culture today. Phrenology in America, one of the most revealing episodes in the history of pre-scientific American psychology, was the remarkable career of phrenology. Early in the 19th century, Gall's colleague, Johann Spurzheim, started on a triumphal tour of the United States. The rigors of the trip took his life after only a few weeks. Spurzheim was followed by the British phrenologist George Combe, who was well received by educators and college presidents. The lectures were too theoretical for American audiences, however, and phrenology fell into the hands of two industrious and businesslike brothers, Orson and Lorenzo Fowler. They minimized the scientific content of phrenology, maximized the practical applications, and set up an office in New York where clients could have their characters read for a fee. They wrote endlessly on the benefits of phrenology and published a phrenological journal that endured from the 1840s to 1911. They traveled around the country, especially the frontier areas, giving lectures and challenging skeptics. Like the great magician Houdini, they accepted any kind of test of their abilities, including blindfolded examinations of volunteer skulls. What made the Fowlers' phrenology so popular was its appeal to the American character. It eschewed the metaphysics for practical application. It pretended to tell employers what people to hire and to advise men which wives to take. The first mental testing movement in America was Galtonian in its scrutiny of individual differences. Furthermore, it was progressive and reformist. Gall had believed the brain's faculties to be set by heredity. The Fowlers, however, said that weak faculties could be improved by practice and overly strong ones could be controlled by efforts of will. Many people sought out the Fowlers for advice on how to lead their lives. They were the first guidance counselors. They also held out the hope that the nation and the world could be improved, if only every person would be phrenologized. Finally, the Fowlers believed they served religion in morality. They encouraged their clients to improve their moral faculties and believed that the existence of the faculty of veneration demonstrated the existence of God, because the existence of the faculty implied the existence of its object. America's native philosophy, pragmatism. The Metaphysical Club. In 1871 and 1872, a group of young, Harvard-educated, well-to-do Bostonians, the very topmost cream of Boston manhood, William James called them, met at the Metaphysical Club to discuss philosophy in the age of Darwin. Among the members of the club were Oliver Wendell Holmes, born 1809 and died in 1894, Holmes was destined to become perhaps the United States' most distinguished jurist and more important for the history of psychology. Clancy Wright, born 1830 and died in 1875, Charles S. Peirce, and William James. All three were important to the founding of psychology in America. Wright articulated an early stimulus response theory of behavior. Peirce carried out the first psychological experiments in the New World, and James laid the foundations of American psychology with his book, Principles of Psychology. The immediate fruit of the Metaphysical Club was America's only homegrown philosophy, pragmatism, a hybrid of Bain, Darwin, and Kant. The club opposed the regnant Scottish philosophy. What is regnant? Regnant, that's a new word. I've never seen that before. What is that, buddy? Regnant definition. All right. Reigning, ruling. Okay. Currently having the greatest influence. We're going to put that in the chat. That's a new word. Regnant. Okay. Adjective. Reigning. Ruling. Okay. That's hard. All right, number 2, a formal definition right here. Gonna drop this here because that's a cool word. I like that word. Regnant. Formal, currently having the greatest influence. Okay, anyway. All three were important to the founding of psychology in America. Wright articulating an early stimulus response theory of behavior. Peirce carried out the first psychological experiments in the New World, and James laid the foundations of American psychology with his book, Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. The immediate fruit of the Metaphysical Club was America's only homegrown philosophy, pragmatism, a hybrid of Bain, Darwin, and Kant. The club opposed the regnant Scottish philosophy, which was dualistic and closely connected to religion and creationism, and proposed a new naturalistic theory of mind. And we're at page 300. You know how it goes. Every 100 pages, we take a shot. I'm not drinking, but you know what I mean. Cheers. Every 100 pages, take a shot. Anyway, from Bain, they took the idea that beliefs or dispositions to behave. Bain defined belief as that upon which a man is prepared to act. From Darwin, they, like most intellectuals of the day, learned to treat mind as part of nature, not a gift from God. More important, this was Wright's contribution. They took the survival of the fittest as a model by which to understand mind. Wright combined Bain's definition with Darwin's theory of natural selection and proposed that a person's beliefs evolve just as species do. As one matures, one's beliefs compete for acceptance, so that adequate beliefs emerge from the survival of the fittest among our original beliefs. This is the essential idea of the individual approach to the psychology of adaptation. And if we substitute behaviors for beliefs, it anticipated the central ideas of B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism. Wright also tried to show how self-consciousness, far from being a mystery to naturalism, evolved from sensory-motor habits. A habit, Wright held, was a relation between a class of stimuli and some response or responses. The cognition needed to link stimulus and response was rudimentary, involving recalled images of past experiences. Self-consciousness arose when one, or people as compared with the animals, became aware of the connection between stimulus and response. Wright's ideas go a long way to making mind part of nature, and they point to the behavioral emphasis of American psychology, in which beliefs are important only insofar as they produce behavior. Charles Saunders Peirce, born 1839 to 1914. I feel like I've heard Charles Saunders Peirce before, and I feel like he was like a virulent anti-black racist. I feel like I've heard his name before, and I looked it up and something wiki came up. It's just not coming to mind right now. I know Thomas Hardy Leahey is not going to mention it, but I feel like I've heard this name mentioned with some wicked racist idea or practice or something like that. But I'm going to continue here. Some historians and philosophers now think that Peirce was the greatest philosopher America has produced. He was trained as a physicist and worked for a time for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. As an undergraduate, he built a simple computer and may have been the first to ask if computers might be capable of emulating human thinking. A small inheritance allowed him to retire from the survey and go to Cambridge. The inheritance was small indeed, and the Peirces lived lives of genteel poverty. He was not an easy man to get along with, and despite the best efforts of James to find him a permanent post at Harvard, nothing but short-term appointments ensued. In contrast to James, whose writing style was fluid and forceful, it was said that his brother Henry was a novelist who wrote like a psychologist, and William was a philosopher who wrote like a novelist. Peirce wrote prose that was awkward and sometimes impenetrable. Peirce's influence was also limited because he published little in his own lifetime. Nevertheless, he summarized the work of the Metaphysical Club, giving pragmatism its first formulation. Given pragmatism's rejection of truth, it is ironic that its name derived from Kant. As a foundational philosopher, Kant had tried to lay philosophical foundations for human knowledge. Nevertheless, he recognized that men and women must act on beliefs that are not certain. A physician, for example, may not be absolutely certain of a diagnosis, but must nevertheless proceed believing the diagnosis is correct. Kant called such contingent belief, which still forms the basis of the actual use of means for the attainment of certain ends, pragmatic belief. The skeptical upshot of the meditations of the Metaphysical Club was that no belief could ever be held with absolute certainty. The best that humans could hope for were beliefs that led to successful actions in the world, natural selection operating to strengthen certain beliefs and weaken others as beliefs struggled for acceptance. Darwin had shown that species were not fixed, and the Metaphysical Club concluded that truth, contrary to Kant, could not be fixed either. All that remained to epistemology then was Kant's pragmatic belief, which Peirce refined into the pragmatic maxim, reflecting the conclusions of the club. Moving on here. Nelson is in the comments. He says, "Hey, Simon, I won't be able to join live stream today, but I will watch and hopefully join you next week." No problem, man. Have a good weekend. Get some rest. Continuing here. In 1879, Peirce published these conclusions in a paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, first read to the Metaphysical Club at the end of its life. Peirce wrote that the whole function of thought is to produce habits of action, and that what we call beliefs are a rule of action, or say, for short, a habit. The essence of belief, he argued, is the establishment of a habit, and different beliefs are distinguished by the different modes of action to which they give rise. Habits must have a practical significance if they are to be meaningful, Peirce went on. Now the identity of a habit depends on how it might lead us to act. Thus we come down to what is tangible and conceivably practical as the root of every real distinction of thought. There is no distinction so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference in practice. In conclusion, the rule for attaining clear ideas is as follows. Consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the objects of our conceptions to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. Or, as Peirce put it more succinctly in 1905, The truth of a belief lies exclusively in its conceivable bearing upon the conduct of life. Peirce's pragmatic maxim was revolutionary because it abandoned the old Platonic aim of a foundational philosophy. It admitted with Heraclitus and the post-Socratic skeptics that nothing can ever be certain, and draws from Darwin the idea that the best beliefs are those that work in adapting us to our changing environment. The pragmatic maxim is also consistent with scientific practice. Peirce had been a working physicist and learned that a scientific concept was useless and therefore meaningless if it could not be translated into some observable phenomenon. Thus, Peirce's pragmatic maxim anticipated the positivist concept of operational definition. Later, when James allowed emotional and ethical considerations to weigh in deciding whether a belief works, Peirce, the hard-headed physicist, refused to go along. Go into the comments. Kamal says pound sign. Pound to Kamal. Salute to you. I know this has not been the most popular book reading on my channel, but shout out to everybody who continues to show support in the live stream, like Kamal, like Nelson, and shout out to Siraj as well for just showing up. You know what I mean? You ain't got to stay for it. You don't have to actually listen to the entire book. This is for whoever out there that this helps. I'm just trying to help somebody who is interested in psychology and wants to have a read along with this book. You know what I mean? So, yeah. Continuing here. In psychology, pragmatism represented a clear articulation of the individual question approach to the psychology of adaptation. It took, as Skinner later would, Darwin's account of species evolution as a model by which to understand individual learning. The pragmatic maxim also anticipated the behavioral turn in American psychology because it says that beliefs are always, if meaningful, manifested in behavior, so that reflection on consciousness for its own sake is idle. Peirce never became a psychologist, but he did aid psychology's development in the United States. He read some of Wundt's research in 1862 and campaigned against the continued reign of Scottish common sense psychology and for the establishment of experimental psychology in U.S. universities. In 1877, he published a psychophysical study of color, the first experimental work to come from America. A student of his, Joseph Jastrow, became one of the leading American psychologists in the first part of the 20th century and an early president of the American Psychological Association. In 1887, Peirce asked the central question of modern cognitive science: can a machine think like a human being? Despite these accomplishments, his influence remained remarkably limited. Pragmatism's great influence on philosophy and psychology came from his associate, William James. America's psychologist, William James, born 1842 and died in 1910. James's Principles of Psychology. James began to work out his own version of pragmatism in the 1870s and 1880s as psychology rather than philosophy. In 1878, he was contracted by the publisher Henry Holt to write a textbook on psychology, and during the 1880s, he published a series of articles that formed the core of his new psychology and were incorporated into the book Principles of Psychology. Its publication in 1890 marks a watershed in the history of American psychology, for it inspired American students as neither the Scots nor Wundt could, and it set the tone for American psychology from 1890 to the present day. James combined the usual interests of a founding psychologist, physiology, and philosophy. Although as a young man, James wanted to be an artist. He began his academic career with an MD and held a variety of posts at Harvard. Beginning as an instructor of physiology, he next saw to the establishment for himself of a chair in psychology. He spent his last years as a professor of philosophy. In Principles, James began to develop his pragmatic philosophy. Psychology is the science of mental life, James told his readers. Its primary method is ordinary introspection, accompanied by the diabolical cunning of German experimentalism and by comparative studies of men, animals, and savages. James rejected sensationistic atomism, the billiard ball theory, also rejected by Wundt. Anticipating the Gestalt psychologist, James said this theory takes the discernible parts of objects to be enduring objects of experience, falsely chopping up the flow of experience. Wrote James, Consciousness does not appear to itself chopped up in bits. Such words as chain or train do not describe it fitly, as it presents itself in the first instance. It is nothing jointed. It flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness, or of subjective life. In Darwinian fashion, James found that what consciousness contains is less important than what it does. It is function, not content, that counts. The primary function of consciousness is to choose, he wrote. It is always interested more in one part of its object than in another, and welcomes and rejects or chooses all the while it thinks. Consciousness creates and serves the ends of the organism, the first of which is survival through adaptation to the environment. For James, however, adaptation is never passive. Consciousness chooses, acting always towards some end. The ceaseless flow of choices affects perception as well as conduct. The mind, in short, works on the data it receives very much as a sculptor works on his block of stone. James's mind is not the passive blank slate of the sensationist. It is a fighter for ends, actively engaged with a practical world of experience. Interesting. Continuing. The challenge of will in the reflex theory of the brain. Note that there are two aspects of consciousness's adaptive nature for James. The first is that consciousness gives its bearers interest. Machines do not want to survive and operate merely on preset habits. If the environment does not suit these habits, it will fail to adapt and will die because it does not care whether it lives or dies. But coping with change is the essence of evolution. And so consciousness has arisen because without it, we would not and could not adapt. The second adaptive aspect of consciousness, choice, depends on having an interest in survival. Consciousness, James taught, arises when instinct and habit cannot cope with new challenges. One can drive a familiar route without the involvement of consciousness, listening to the radio or talking to a friend. One's consciousness is elsewhere, as Descartes said. However, should one hear on the radio that a falling tree has blocked one's usual route, one becomes immediately conscious of driving because one has to choose a new route to cope with the changed environment. For James, it was clear that without consciousness, there would be no survival. For without it, we would be clockwork mechanisms, blind to the environment and uncaring about our fate. At the same time, however, James endorsed the path to physiology, saying that psychology must be cerebralist. It is a fundamental assumption that the brain is the one immediate bodily condition of the mental operation, and the principles, all 1,377 pages of it, is more or less of a proof that the postulate is correct. He applauded Hartley's attempt to show that the laws of association are cerebral laws, and so far as association stands for a cause, it is between processes in the brain. This seemed to involve James in a contradiction. The brain machine must make choices. He had said that consciousness plays a positive role in human and animal life, an explicitly rejected mechanism, or what he called the automation theory. For James, evolutionary naturalism demanded that consciousness exist because it fulfilled a vital adaptive function. A dumb machine knows no direction. It is like dice thrown forever on a table. What chance is there that the highest number will turn up oftener than the lowest? James argued that consciousness increases the efficacy of the cerebral machine by loading its dice. Wrote James, loading its dice would bring constant pressure to bear in favor of those of its performances that serve the interests of the brain's owner. Consciousness transforms survival from mere hypothesis into an imperative decree. Survival shall occur, and therefore organs must so work. Every actually existing consciousness seems to itself, at any rate, to be a fighter for ends. Consciousness thus possesses survival value. Association may depend on cerebral laws, but our will can, through emphasis and reinforcement, direct chains of association to serve our interests, and their direction is all that the most eager advocate of free will must demand. For by directing association, it's direct thinking and hence action. The conflict between James's cerebralist view of consciousness and his belief in the behavioral efficacy of consciousness shows up clearly in his theory of emotion, the James Lange theory of emotion, proposed independently by William James in 1884 and the Dutch physiologist Carl Lange, who lived from 1834 to 1900. Via its formulation in James's Principle of Psychology, the James Lange theory of emotion has influenced every psychologist who has tackled the topic of emotion and is still widely discussed today. As a psychologist of consciousness, James wanted to explain how and why emotions arise in conscious experience. He contrasted his theory of emotions with that of folk psychology, admitting that at least at first glance, his was less plausible. Our natural way of thinking about emotions is that the mental perception of some fact excites the mental affection called the emotion, and that this latter state of mind gives rise to the bodily expression. My theory, on the contrary, is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. Common sense says, we lose our fortune, are sorry and weep. We meet a bear, are frightened and run. We are insulted by a rival, are angry and strike. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect, and that one mental state is not immediately induced by the other, that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful, as the case may be. Without the bodily states following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. We might then see the bear and judge it best to run, receive the insult and deem it right to strike, but we should not actually feel afraid or angry. Stated in this crude way, the hypothesis is pretty sure to meet with immediate disbelief, and yet neither may nor far-fetched considerations are required to mitigate its paradoxical character, and possibly to produce conviction of its truth. In formulating his theory of emotion, James wrestled with issues that remain unresolved today. The first issue is the most basic. What is an emotion? Many, perhaps most, of our perceptions are purely cognitive in form. The perceptions of my computer screen, my mouse pad, a mug of tea on my desk are pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. It is certainly true that, should I meet a bear in the woods, my perception of it will be worn, to say the least. But in what does this warmth, the emotion of fear, consist? What is added to consciousness in the case of the bear that is not added in the case of my mug of tea? James's answer was virtually dictated by reflex theory of the brain. Recall that in reflex theory, the brain was seen as being rather like a telephone switchboard, providing connections between stimulus and response, but incapable of originating experience, feeling, or action on its own. James gave this rather passive view of the brain a dynamic twist, holding that any perceived stimulus acts on the nervous system to automatically bring about some adaptive bodily response, whether learned or innate. Thus, if a large animal rears up and roars at me, I possess an innate automatic tendency to run away. When I am driving and a traffic light turns red, I have a learned and automatic tendency to step on my car's brakes. To understand some of the later debates about consciousness, especially the motor theory of consciousness, we should remember that what's evolutionary adaptive in this sequence of events is my running away. Whatever I may subjectively feel on seeing the bear is completely irrelevant as long as I escape from its clutches. I could, as James says, see the bear and coolly reason that running away is a wise thing to do, feeling nothing at all. Driverless cars that seek safe paths and avoid dangers have been built, but of course they feel neither desire nor fear. Yet, because we humans do feel fear and desire, it is the psychologist's job to figure out what fear or desire, the extra state of consciousness added to the cognitive perception of the bear, is. James proposed that the emotional something extra is the registration in consciousness of the responses of our body caused by the sight of the bear. Because he thought of the brain as a mere connecting device, James located emotions not in the brain itself, but outside the brain, in the viscera. Our stomach churns with fear, and the muscles that work to take us away from the bear. With regard to simple emotions like fear or lust, as opposed to subtler emotions like envy or love, James believed that the most important bodily feelings that constitute emotions arise in the viscera. In summary, according to the James Lang theory of emotion, fear does not cause our intestines to churn and our legs to run, nor do churning intestines and running legs cause us to feel fear. Instead, fear simply is our churning innards and running legs. Emotions are states of the body. So, the James Lang theory of emotion, the emotional stimulus, for example, seeing the bear, that does not connect to the sensory cortex in the cerebral cortex, but those connect to the motor cortex, and that causes a bodily response, which then affects the cerebral cortex, and then we have feeling. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. More generally, James said that mental states have two sorts of bodily effects. First, unless some inhibition is present, the thought of an act automatically leads to the execution of the act. Second, mental states cause internal bodily changes, including covert motor responses, changes in heart rate, glandular secretions, and perhaps processes more subtle still. Therefore, James argued, it will be safe to lay down the general law that no mental modification ever occurs, which is not accompanied or followed by a bodily change. The contents of consciousness are thus determined not only by sensations coming in from outside, but by kinesthetic feedback, as we call it today, from the body's motor activity. Our psychology must therefore take account not only of the conditions antecedent to mental states, but of their resulting consequences as well. The whole neural organism is but a machine for converting stimuli into reactions, and the intellectual part of our life is knit up with the middle or central part of the machine's operations. And here lies the rub for James. If emotions consist in our registration of the emotion-producing stimulus, for example, the bear, and in the bodily responses automatically triggered by the stimulus, for example, the churning of the viscera and running away, then we may question if emotions actually cause behavior. If we feel afraid because we run away, then fear is not the cause of running away, but a conscious state that comes along for the ride, as it were. The James Lang theory of emotion seems to be quite consistent with the automation theory of the brain that James rejected. Consciousness, including emotion, has no more to do with causing behavior than an automobile color has to do with making it go. A car has to have some color, and living beings, it appears, have to have conscious experiences. But neither the car's color nor the brain's consciousness actually does anything. As a science of the causes of behavior, psychology might be able to ignore consciousness altogether. James found himself caught in the same dilemma felt by other reluctant believers in mechanism between the heart's feeling of freedom and the intellect's scientific declaration of determinism. James was deeply committed to free will from personal experience. As a young man, he had pulled himself out of a black depression by literally willing himself to live again. And dogged by depression his whole life, he made human will the center of his philosophy. However, in his psychology, committed to cerebralism, he found himself almost forced to accept determinism as the only scientifically acceptable view of behavior. He stoutly resisted the conclusion, denouncing mechanistic conceptions of human conduct, and, as we have seen, proclaiming that consciousness decreed survival and commanded the body. After writing Principles, James abandoned psychology for philosophy in 1892 and developed his own brand of pragmatism. He tried to resolve the struggle between the head and the heart by setting the feelings of the heart on an equal footing with the cognitions of the head. Nevertheless, the conflict remained, and the influence of principles was to lead American psychologists away from consciousness and toward behavior, and so away from James's own definition of psychology as the science of mental life. James's envoy to psychology. What is envoy in this word? I've never seen this word. Envoy. Envoy. A short stanza including an author's concluding work. Okay. What else? I'm gonna envoy. Noun. There's two definitions. Okay. I'm gonna put those here. I haven't seen this word. All right, envoy, noun, plural envoys. A short stanza concluding a ballad, an author's concluding words. Okay. All right, let's continue. James's envoy to psychology. For all its influence on psychology, James's principles turned out to be for him just a diversion. In 1892, he brought out a one-volume briefer course, more suitable as a classroom text, but pronounced himself wary of psychology. In that same year, he secured a successor, Hugo Munsterberg, as Harvard's experimental psychologist, and resumed his career as a philosopher, making 1892 a doubly significant year for psychology, as it also saw the founding of the APA. James's ambiguous feeling about scientific psychology surfaced in a reply to a negative review of his Principles of Psychology by George Trumbull Ladd, born 1842 and died in 1921. Although Ladd accepted some aspects of scientific psychology, he defended the old, religiously oriented psychology of the Scottish tradition, finding naturalistic psychology inadequate to serve human souls. James agreed that psychology was not then a science, but a mass of phenomenal description, gossip, and myth. He wrote the Principles, he said, wishing by treating psychology like a natural science to help her become one. James correctly set out the new psychology's theme as a natural science. The cerebralist reflex action theory is invaluable because, by treating behavior as the outcome of physiologically rooted motor habits and impulses, it works towards the practical prediction and control that is the aim of all natural sciences. Psychology should no longer be regarded as a part of philosophy, but as a branch of biology. In one important respect, James agreed with Ladd because he believed that scientific psychology could not, in fact, address many important questions concerning human life. For example, as we have seen, James believed passionately in free will. In the Principles, he discussed attention as an important process by which we seem to willfully choose to attend to one thing rather than another. He contrasted cause theories of attention, which say that paying attention is a willful act, with effect theories of attention, which say that attention is an effect produced by cognitive processes over which we have no control. James could find no way to decide between the theories on scientific grounds and concluded by endorsing cause theories on moral grounds because they accept the reality of free will and moral responsibility. However, because moral considerations lie outside science, James ended his chapter on attention without further elaboration, indicating that the issue could not be decided on scientific grounds alone. In his paper, James also touched on the future of psychology as an applied discipline. What people want, he said, is a practical psychology that tells people how to act, that makes a difference to life. The kind of psychology which could cure a case of melancholy or charm a chronic insane delusion away ought certainly to be preferred to the most seraphic insight into the nature of the soul. Seraphic, that's another word. Basically, what I'm interpreting here is, once again, that psychology should be practical and not metaphysical or theoretical or philosophical. Or what is angelic? Oh, seraphim, seraphic, characteristic of or resembling a seraph or seraphim. Why didn't you just say angelic? Some people just try to do the most. Okay, it's an adjective. Adjective, we're going to put that in the chat. Okay, I'm trying to help y'all learn some words, man. A seraphic smile. That's funny. All right, anyway, continuing here. All right, where were we? Seraphic insight into the nature of the soul. Psychology should be practical, should make a difference. James not only voiced the growing practical aims of American psychologists as they organized and professionalized, but he announced his own touchstone of truth. True ideas make a difference to living. James's next task then was the full development of the characteristically American philosophy, pragmatism. By the mid-1890s, the outlines of a new psychology, distinctly American in character, were emerging. The interest of American psychologists was shifting away from what consciousness contains and toward the consciousness and towards what consciousness does and how it aids an organism, human or animal, in its adaptation to a changing environment. In short, mental content was becoming less important than mental functions. This new functional psychology was a natural offspring of Darwinism and the new American experience. Mind consciousness would not exist, James had said in the principle, unless it served the adaptive needs of its host. In the America of the 1890s, it was clear that consciousness's prime function was to guide adjustment to the rapid flow of change engulfing immigrant and farmer, worker, and professional. In a world of constant change, ancient truths, mental content, fixed doctrines became uncouth every day. Heraclitus's universe had at last become true, and people no longer believed in Plato's eternal forms. In the Heraclitean flux, the only eternal constant was change, and therefore the only reality of experience, psychology's subject matter, was adjustment to change. Jamesian pragmatism. James went on to develop his own version of pragmatism, a more expansive and romantic pragmatism than Peirce's narrow scientific version. Pragmatism had begun with the rigorously scientific attitude of C.S. Peirce as a way of determining whether human concepts had any empirical content. But Peirce's conception was too narrowly cognitive to meet fully the everyday demands of a post-Darwinian Heraclitean world. It had become clear that there were no Platonic permanent truths, yet people find it difficult to live without some certainty, some fixed star to steer by. James made, in pragmatism, a fixed star of a new sort. James offered a method of making, rather than finding, truths, and in elaborating Peirce's pragmatism, he included emotional learnings that Peirce could not abide. In a series of works beginning in 1895 and culminating in Pragmatism, James developed a comprehensive pragmatic approach to the problems of science, philosophy, and life. He argued that ideas were worthless, or, more precisely, meaningless, unless they mattered to our lives. So American. Very American. This shit don't mean nothing. James is Jesus Christ. He was basically Joe America. Joe America. Ideas don't matter. These motherfucker shit's meaningless. All right. Anyway, an idea with no consequences was pointless and meaningless, as he wrote in Pragmatism. True ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. That is the practical difference it makes for us to have true ideas. The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. Its verity is, in fact, an event, a process. So far, this sounds like Peirce, a hard-headed Darwinian approach to truth. James went beyond Peirce, however, when he said that the truth of an idea should be tested against its agreement with all of one's experience, nothing being omitted. When Peirce had said, we weigh ideas against experience, he meant experience in a narrow cognitive sense, the scientist's apprehension of the physical world. James, however, with the Romantics, saw no reason to value one kind of experience above another. Non-cognitive experience, hopes, fears, loves, ambitions, were just as much part of a person's living reality as sensations of numbers, hardness, or mass. Ideas, James said, which themselves are but parts of our experience, become true just in so far as they help us get into satisfactory relations with other parts of our experience. James's criterion of truth was thus much broader than Peirce's and could apply to any concept, no matter how seemingly fanciful or metaphysical. To the tough-minded empiricist, the ideas of God or of free will were meaningless, literally neither true nor false, because they were devoid of sensory content. To James, such ideas nevertheless could make a difference in the way we conduct our lives. If the idea of free will and its corollary, moral responsibility, lead men and women to live better, happier lives than if they believed in the automation theory, then free will was true. Or more exactly, it was made true in the lives and experience of the people who accepted it. James's pragmatism held no metaphysical prejudices, unlike traditional rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism sticks to logic and the empyrean. Empiricism sticks to the external senses. Pragmatism is willing to take anything, to follow either logic or the senses, and to count the humblest and most personal experiences. She will count mystical experiences if they have practical consequences. Against the cold intellectual positivism of Peirce's pragmatism, James asserted the claims of the heart, so congenial to Americans since the time of Jonathan Edwards. As James recognized, his pragmatism was anti-intellectual in setting heart and head as equal in the search for truth. Compared to rationalists and searchers for perfect truth, James wrote, "A radical pragmatist is a happy-go-lucky anarchist sort of creature." Functional psychologists and their heirs, the behaviorists, would likewise depreciate the intellect. Learning and problem solving, as we shall see, would soon be explained in terms of blind trial and error and resulting reward and punishment, not in terms of directed cognitive activity. Pragmatism was a functional philosophy, a method, not a doctrine. It provided a way of coping with the Heraclitean flux of experience, no matter what the challenge or the topic. In the fields of theology and physics, politics and ethics, philosophy and psychology, it offered a star to navigate by. Although one could not hope to find a fixed final truth about God or matter, society or morality, metaphysics or the mind, one could at least know what questions to ask. Does this concept matter? Does it make a difference to me, to my society, to my science? Pragmatism promised that even though there were no final solutions to any problem, at least there was a method of concretely resolving problems here and now. Heretofore, philosophers had searched for the first principles, indubitable ideas on which to erect a philosophical system and a philosophy of science. James's pragmatism gave up the quest for first principles, recognizing that after Darwin, no truth could be fixed. Instead, James offered a philosophy that worked by turning away from content, fixed truths, and towards functions, what ideas do for us. As he did this, psychologists were quietly developing a psychology of function, studying not the ideas of mind contained, but how the mind worked in adapting its organism to a changing environment. At the same time, they hoped that psychological science would work in the modern world, meeting the challenges of immigration and education, madness and feeble-mindedness, business and politics. I'm sorry, why isn't James called, what's this guy's first name? What was his name? Sorry. Oh my God, I forgot his first name. Charles James? What was his? Okay. What's his first name? Yes, sorry. William James. William James. I mean, it's just a very bland name. Anyway, why isn't William James called like the first postmodernist? Like he's essentially saying like nothing has concrete meaning, no real truth can be found. Therefore, we should only think about what's essential, what's pragmatic, what actually functions, what can we use. Very utilitarian, but also very postmodernist, I would say. I don't know. We're going to do this. How many more pages? We're on page 308. We're on page 308 right here. And we got until page 325. So we're going to take a little break. We're going to take 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to just relax, chill, come back here from mentalism to behavioralism. Then we're going to read the rest from 308 to 325. That should take about, I hope, no more than an hour and a half or so. And then we're going to come back. So, yeah, this will be chopped. If you're going to see this in the playback, it's just going to be chopped. And we're going to just start immediately right here. From mentalism to behaviorism. All right? So, y'all be easy. All right, welcome back to episode 21. This is part 2 of reading for today, chapter 10, A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity by Thomas Hardy Leahey. We read a lot in the previous section. We were reading about William James and how he created a sort of utilitarian, pragmatist view of philosophy and psychology for the American context. Now we're picking up on page 308, from mentalism to behaviorism. We're going to the beginnings of behaviorism. We're going to pick up right here, and then we're reading until the end of this chapter, which is on page 325. So we have quite a few pages, but we're going to knock it out. We're going to get it all done today. All right? So, from mentalism to behaviorism. In April 1913, the philosopher Warner Fite reviewed anonymously, as was the custom at the Nation, 3 books on the science of man. One was a text on genetics, but the other 2 were psychological. Hugo Munsterberg's Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, and Maurice Parmely's The Science of Human Behavior. Fite observed that psychology in 1913 seemed little concerned with consciousness. Munsterberg explicitly stated that the psychological way of ordinary life, in which we try to understand our neighbor by entering into his mental functions, is not psychological analysis. Fite concluded, precisely, true psychological analysis ignores all personal experience of mentality. The science of psychology is, then, the finished result of what we may call the conspiracy of naturalism, in which each investigator has bound himself by a strange oath to obtain all his knowledge from observation of the actions of his fellows, as a naturalist studies the chemical elements of or the stars. Munsterberg. And never under any circumstances to conceive them in the light of his own experience of his living. Even the psychologist's mental states or objects of consciousness are only so many hypothetical entities read from without. What is to be expected from a science of humanity which ignores all that is most distinctive of man? Clearly, psychology had changed since James wrote his Principles. James and Wundt had proclaimed a new science of mental life, the study of consciousness as such. Freud used introspection and inference to enter his patient's mind, both conscious and unconscious. But by 1913, Fite found a psychology aimed at behavior, not consciousness, based on treating people as things, not as conscious agents. The transition from mentalism, defining psychology as the scientific study of consciousness, to behavioralism, defining psychology as the scientific study of behavior, the motor theory of consciousness, from 1892 to 1896. The spirit of the new psychology in America was that of James's Principles of Psychology. Cattell said it had breathed the breath of life into the dust of psychology. James himself detested the professional, even commercial attitudes overcoming academia and harbored doubts about the validity of scientific psychology. Nevertheless, it was upon his text that American psychology was built. Hugo Munsterberg and Action Theory. By 1892, James was wary of psychology and eager to move on to philosophy. He looked for someone to replace him as Harvard's experimental psychologist, and his attention was drawn to Hugo Munsterberg, who lived between 1863 and 1916. Munsterberg, though a student of Wundt, nevertheless disagreed with his teacher in ways James found attractive. Like James, Munsterberg addressed the problem of will in terms of feedback from automatic motor responses to stimuli. However, his action theory developed a more thoroughgoing motor theory of consciousness that did away with will altogether, a step James could never take, and reduced consciousness from an active striver for ends to a mere spectator of its bearer's actions. In a dissertation Wundt refused to accept, Munsterberg addressed the nature of will from a psychological standpoint. In the 18th century, David Hume had set out to find the psychological basis of the self, but found that it dissolved under his introspective gaze. Now Munsterberg set out to find the psychological basis of will, only to find that it too seemed to be more illusion than reality. Will is an important concept in philosophy and folk psychology, but in what Munsterberg asked, does it consist as a psychological experience? Moreover, Munsterberg questioned the place of any concept of free will in scientific psychology. From the time of Locke, it had been recognized that reconciling freedom of will with scientific determinism was no easy feat. James had been driven from psychology by his inability to reconcile the two. In particular, there seemed no room for will in the reflex concept of the brain, then coming to full development. After the work of Frisch and Hitzig, there seemed no place to put will. The brain produced behavior simply by associating incoming stimulus nerves with outgoing response nerves. As far as physiology went, there was no need for consciousness at all. Stimulus meant psychological process, meant response, reflex theory seemed now to be a tenable conception of how behavior is produced. As Munsterberg wrote, for the preservation of the individual, it is obviously irrelevant whether a purposeful motion is accompanied by contents of consciousness or not. However, there are conscious contents, the traditional subject matter of psychology, to explain. Why do we believe we have an effective will? Like James, Munsterberg located the source of this belief in behavior. Our ideas are the product of our readiness to act. Our actions shape our knowledge. Our feelings of will, the motor theory explains, comes about because we are aware of our behavior and our incipient tendencies to behave. Thus, I might announce that I'm going to stand up from my chair, not because I've reached a decision to stand up, but because the motor process of standing have just begun and have entered consciousness. I feel my will to be effective because generally the incipient tendencies to act are followed by real action, and the former triggers memories of the latter. Because the covert tendencies have usually, in fact, preceded overt behavior, I believe my will is usually carried out. The motor theory of consciousness can be summarized as stimulus creates consciousness, and stimulus also creates physiological response. The physiological response creates reaction, and that reaction creates consciousness. The content of consciousness are determined by stimuli impinging upon us by our overt behaviors and by peripheral changes in muscles and glands produced by the physiological processes linking stimulus and response. Munsterberg, unlike James, was not afraid of the implications of the motor theory of consciousness. He concluded that consciousness is an epiphenomenon that plays no role in causing behavior. Consciousness observed the world and its body's resulting actions, falsely believing that it connected the two when in fact it was the brain that did so. In this conception, psychology must be physiological in a reductive sense, explaining consciousness in terms of underlying physiological process, especially at the periphery. Practical applied psychology, a field in which Munsterberg was quite active, would perforce be behavioral, explaining human action as the outcome of human circumstances. The motor theory of consciousness was not confined to James or Munsterberg. In one form or another, it grew in influence. We have before us now the central philosophical psychological theme of 1900 to 1920. What, if anything, does consciousness do? The motor theory of consciousness abetted the rise of behavioralism. If the theory is true, consciousness, in fact, does nothing. So why, except from faith in the old definition of psychology as the study of consciousness, should we study it? The study of consciousness seemed increasingly irrelevant to American psychologists, building a socially and commercially useful profession. John Dewey and the reflex arc. Coming under the influence of James's principles, the philosopher John Dewey, born 1859 and died 1952, moved away from his youthful belief in Hegelian idealism and began to develop his own pragmatic conception of consciousness, instrumentalism. In the mid-1890s, he produced a series of important but tediously written papers that, taking the principles as the footings, laid the foundations of his lifelong attempt to bring together philosophy, psychology, and ethics in a harmonious whole. These papers also furnished the central conceptions of America's native psychology, functionalism. The most influential of these papers was the reflex arc concept in psychology, published in 1896. Dewey criticized the traditional associationist reflex arc concept. Stimulus creates idea, which creates a response, as artificially breaking up behavior into disjointed parts. He did not deny that stimulus, sensation, idea, and response exist. He did, however, deny that they were distinct events like three beads on a string. Instead, Dewey considered stimulus, idea, and response to be divisions of labor in an overall coordination of action as the organism adjusts to its environment. Developing his own motor theory of consciousness, Dewey regarded sensation not as passive registration of an impression, but as behavior dynamically interacting with other behaviors occurring at the same time. So, to a soldier anxiously awaiting contact with the enemy, the sound of a twig snapping has one significance and fills consciousness. To a hiker in a peaceful woods, it has quite another. Indeed, the hiker may not even notice the snapping sound. Dewey made here a decisive move whose significance, buried in his dry abstract prose, is not immediately apparent. We might, with Wundt and James, attribute the differences in experience of the twig snapping to willfully focused attention. The soldier is actively listening for sounds of approach. The hiker is attending to the songs of birds. But Dewey's motor theory followed Hume in dispensing with the self and followed Munsterberg in dispensing with will. It is the current behavior, claimed Dewey, that gives a sensation its significance, or even determines if a stimulus becomes a sensation at all. A stimulus counts as a sensation and takes on value only if it has a relationship with our current behavior. James had advanced a cerebralist approach to mind, but had not fully drawn out the implications of this view. Dewey saw the behavior often runs off by itself, occasioning no sensations or ideas in any significant sense of the term. It is only when behavior needs to be newly coordinated to reality, that is, needs to be adjusted, that sensation and emotion arise. The hiker's behavior need not be adjusted to the snap of a twig, and his walking continues uninterrupted. The soldier urgently needs to coordinate his behavior to the snap of a twig, and its sound thus looms large in consciousness. Moreover, the soldier's emotion, fear, apprehension, and perhaps anger at the enemy are felt. Dewey argued only because his behavior is in check. His emotions arise from feedback from his thwarted action tendencies. Emotion, said Dewey, is a sign of conflicting dispositions to act. In the soldier's case, to fight or flee. Could he do either immediately and wholeheartedly, he would feel nothing, Dewey said. Dewey's formulation of the motor theory of consciousness was centrally important for later American psychology. In 1934, his reflex arc paper was chosen as one of the most important articles ever published in Psychological Review. Dewey showed that psychology could do away with central willing, self, or idealism, already attenuated by James. Rather than assigning the control of perception and decision to an inaccessible transcendental ego, it became possible to account for them in terms of coordinated, ever-changing adaptive behaviors. So hearing was one sort of behavior, attending another, and responding a third. All were coordinated toward the end of survival in a constant, fluid stream of behavior ever in motion, not unlike the daily lives of contemporary Americans. Dewey's ideas became the commonplaces of functionalism. More broadly, Dewey began in these papers to develop the progressive view mentioned earlier that the self did not exist in nature but was a social construction. From Philosophy to Biology, Functional Psychology, from 1896 to 1910, experiments became functional. Traditional psychology of consciousness, while inevitably investigating mental processes, such as apperception, retained an emphasis on conscious content as the subject matter of psychology. Its primary novelty was subjecting consciousness to experimental control in order to capture consciousness for science. However, as we saw earlier in this chapter, William James, in his Principles of Psychology, shifted the interest of American psychology from content to process. As he pictured the mind, mental contents were evanescent, fleeting things, seen once and never to return. What endured were mental functions, especially the function of choosing. James's new emphasis was reinforced by the new American experience of the 1890s. Old truths replaced by new ones, familiar scenes by strange ones. What remained constant was the process of adjusting to the new. The development of the motor theory of consciousness continued the process of depreciating mental content and, by implication, the method used to access it, introspection. In the motor theory, consciousness contained sensations from the world and from motor activity, but played little, if any, role in causing behavior. Although, of course, it remained possible to introspect and report conscious content, as Munsterberg continued to do so in his laboratory, it could easily be seen as pointless, even irresponsible. American psychologists agreed with James. What was needed was a psychology that met the pragmatic test by being effective. Awash and change, Americans needed a psychology that did something to cope with the emerging modern world. Introspection only revealed what was. Americans needed to prepare for what is to be. James, Munsterberg, and Dewey were preparing for the new functional psychology by turning their attention from content to adaptive process. At the same time, experimental psychologists shifted the focus of their research from introspective reports of conscious content to objective determinations of the correlation between stimulus and response. As developed by Wundt, the experimental method had two aspects. A standardized controlled stimulus was presented to a subject who responded to it in some way, reporting at the same time the contents of his or her experience. Wundt, as a mentalist, was interested in the experience produced by given conditions and used objective results as clues to the processes that produce conscious content. However, in the hands of American psychologists, emphasis shifted from conscious experience to the determination of responses by stimulus conditions. As an example, let us take an experiment on how people locate an object in space on the basis of sound. In this experiment, a blindfolded observer, one of them, JBW, was probably John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, was seated in a chair at the center of apparatus that could present a sound at any point around the observer. After setting the sound generator at a given point, the experimenter made it produce a tone, and the observer pointed to where he believed the sound was coming from. Then the observer provided an introspective report of the conscious experience provoked by the sound. Watson reported seeing a mental image of the apparatus surrounding him with the sound generator located where he pointed. Now one could, as a mentalist would, focus on the introspective report as the data of interest, aiming to describe and explain this bit of mental content. On the other hand, one could focus on the accuracy of the pointing response, correlating to the position of the sound generator with the observer's indicated position. In the angle experiment, although both objective data, the correlation of stimulus position with the observer's response, and introspective reports were discussed, the latter were given secondary importance. The objective findings were highlighted and extensively discussed. The introspective findings were briefly mentioned at the end of the article. Under influence of the motor theory of consciousness, introspection was becoming less important because consciousness played no causal role in determining behavior, and the same attitude affected the experiments of the time. From the inception of American psychology, introspective reports were first isolated from the objective results and then shortened or removed altogether, as observers became subjects. In addressing how behavior is adjusted to stimuli, American psychologists turned from the study of mental content to the study of adaptive mental functions. Another experiment, Bryan and Harter, reveals a sense in which American psychology was becoming functional, socially functional. Bryan, an experimental psychologist, and Harter, a former railroad telegrapher turned graduate student in psychology, investigated the acquisition of telegraphic skills by new railroad telegraphers. Their report contained no introspective reports at all, but instead charted the students' gradual improvement over months of practice. This completely objective study was socially significant because Bryan and Harter were studying an important skill learned by people who were assuming an important role in industrialized America. As the railroads expanded and knit together the island communities of formerly rural America, railroad telegraphers were vital. They kept track of what goods were sent where, of what trains were going to what places. In short, they were the communication links that made the whole railroad system function. So important was the training of railroad telegraphers that the Union and Wabash Railroad commissioned Bryan and Harter's study. They brought psychological research to bear on a topic of real social and commercial value. Their study is significant in another respect as well. It foreshadowed the central problem of experimental psychology 40 years later. The traditional psychology of consciousness, mentalism, had primarily investigated perception and its allied functions because it was these that produced introspectable mental contents. But in the post-Darwinian psychology of James and his followers, consciousness was important for what it does, adjusting the organism to its environment. Gradual adjustment over time is learning, finding out about the environment and then behaving in accord with it. Bryan and Harter plotted learning curves and discussed how the novice telegraphers gradually adjusted to the demands of their jobs. In its objectivism, in its concern with a socially useful problem, and in its choice of learning as subject matter, Bryan and Harter's paper was a sign of things to come. It is no wonder, therefore, that in 1943 it was voted by leading American psychologists as the most important experimental study yet published in the Psychological Review and one of the 5 most important papers of any kind. By 1904, it was clear that the objective method in which responses were correlated with stimuli was at least as important as the introspective analysis of consciousness. Speaking before the International Congress of Arts and Science, Cattell, the American pioneer in psychology, said, "I am not convinced that psychology should be limited to the study of consciousness as such," which of course had been the definition of psychology for James and Wundt. His own work with mental tests, Cattell said, is nearly as independent of introspection as work in physics or in zoology. Although introspection and experiment should continually cooperate, it was obvious from the brute argument of accomplished fact that much of psychology now existed apart from introspection. Although Cattell seemed to place introspection and objective measurement on an equal footing, it is clear from his tone and from his later call for applied psychology that the objective behavioral approach to psychology was on the rise. Functional psychology defined. In both theory and research, then, American psychology was moving away from the traditional psychology of conscious content and toward a psychology of mental adjustment inspired by evolutionary theory. Interestingly, it was not an American psychologist who spotted and identified this new trend, but the staunchest defender of a pure psychology of content, E.B. Titchener. In his Postulates of a Structural Psychology, published in 1898, Titchener cogently distinguished several kinds of psychology, and although others may have disagreed about which kind of psychology was best, his terminology endured. Titchener drew a broad analogy among three kinds of biology and three kinds of psychology. In biology, the anatomist, the student of morphology, carefully dissects the body to discover the organs that compose it, revealing the body's structure. Once an organ is isolated and described, it is the job of the physiologist to figure out its function, what it does. Finally, one might study how an organ develops in the course of embryogenesis and postnatal development, and how the organ came into being in the course of evolution. Such studies constitute genetic biology. Similarly, in psychology, the experimental psychologist, by which Titchener meant himself and his students, dissects consciousness into component parts. This anatomy of the mind defines structural psychology. What the revealed structures do is the province of psychological physiology, functional psychology. The development of mental structures and functions is the subject matter of genetic psychology, which investigates the course of individual and phylogenetic development. In Titchener's estimation, structural psychology logically preceded functional psychology, because only after mental structures have been isolated and described could their functions be ascertained. At the same time, Titchener noted the appeal of functional psychology. Its roots were ancient, its analysis of mind hewed close to common sense, as it employed faculty concepts such as memory, imagination, and judgment, and it seemed to promise immediate practical application. Citing Dewey's reflex arc paper, Titchener also acknowledged that functional psychology was growing in influence. Nevertheless, Titchener urged psychologists to avoid the lures of functional psychology and to stick to the tough scientific job of experimental introspective psychology. Titchener's paper marked the beginning of a struggle between structuralism and functionalism to control American psychology. His third kind of psychology, genetic psychology, was just underway and offered no theoretical perspective of its own. However, because the study of development focused on mental operations rather than introspective content, and children were poor introspectors anyway, genetic psychology was a natural ally of functionalism. As it turned out, although Titchener set the terms of America's first war in psychological theory, his defeat was inevitable. Going up here. So E.B. Titchener's description of three approaches to psychology. We have the field of biology, morphology, physiology, ontogeny, subject matter, structure, function, development. In the field of psychology, experimental psychology relates to morphology and structure. Functional psychology relates to physiology and is related to function. And genetic psychology relates to ontogeny, and it's all about development. All right, on to from undercurrent to main current. In the decades following Titchener's postulates, it became apparent that other physiologists found his analysis correct but reversed his priorities. In his December 1900 presidential address to the APA, Pierce's one-time collaborator, Joseph Jastrow, explored some currents and undercurrents in psychology. He declared that psychology is the science of mental function, not content. The functional approach arose out of evolution. It at once cast a blinding light on dark areas of psychology, long held by dogmatism, misconception, and neglect, and breathed a new life into the dry bones of psychology. Jastrow correctly observed that although concern with mental function pervaded current research, it was not the central subject of investigation, but rather gave a distinctive color tone to American psychology. Jastrow saw functional psychology as a growing undercurrent, which he wanted to bring forward as a main current in the development of psychology. Functional psychology, said Jastrow, is more Catholic than structural psychology. It welcomes to psychology the previously excluded topics of comparative psychology, abnormal psychology, mental testing, the study of the average person, and even psychical research. although this last topic clearly troubled him. Jastrow predicted that functional psychology would prove to have more value to practical affairs than structural psychology. Finally, he noted, as we have, that all these trends are characteristically American, and he correctly prophesied that the functional, not structural, psychology. Functional psychologists adopted James's conception of consciousness and moved it further toward behavioralism. Thaddeus Bolton wrote, "Mind is to be regarded as an outgrowth of conduct, a superior and more direct means of adjusting the organism to the environment." And H. Heath Bowden, in 1904, added, "The most fundamental statement we can make about consciousness is that it is action. Conscious content as such is not very important to the functionalist theory of mind, which says that mind is a set of processes whose biological value lies in its ability to be summoned forth when its organism finds itself faced with a new situation. It is not needed when instincts are adequate to the stimuli at hand or when previously learned habits are functioning smoothly. Consciousness is a sometime thing, needed only occasionally, and it would not be long before other psychologists dispensed with mind altogether." As Frank Thilly in 1905 pointed out, the functional view of consciousness retained James's fatal flaw. Along with just about everyone else, James and the functional psychologists following him held to mind-body parallelism, while at the same time arguing that consciousness actively intervenes in the activities of the organism. Bolton was aware of the problem and tried to maintain that although consciousness does not affect nervous processes, it somehow plays a role in learning. This was not a happy position for functional psychologists to be in, and they would be rescued or replaced by the bolder behaviorist ready to chuck consciousness completely out of psychology. After all, if one can see conscious content in behavior, as Bolton maintained, why not just stick to talking about behavior? By 1905, it was clear to contemporary psychologists that the functional tide was in. Edward Franklin Buckner, who for some years wrote for Psychological Bulletin an annual accounting of the year's psychological progress, observed the widespread acceptance and defense of the functional as over against the structural view of psychology. The replacement of the older system by a new one did have the unfortunate effect, Buckner noted, of starting the development of the field all over again, undoing cumulative progress. In the same volume, Felix Arnold raised the great cry of current psychologists. What is it, consciousness? What is consciousness good for? He praised functionalists for giving up the old view of perception Bolton had attacked and replacing it with perception conceived as a motor process, determining serial reactions toward an object. In the same year, Mary Calkins, born 1863 and died in 1930, Calkins took the opportunity of her APA presidential address to advance her self-psychology as a way to reconcile structural and functional psychologies. If psychology is conceived as the study of a real psychological self, possessing both conscious content and mental functions, each system could be viewed as contributing part of the total psychological picture. Although Calkins aggressively pushed her self-psychology over the years in every form she could find, it seems to have found few followers. The time of compromise had passed. In 1907, Buckner wrote that in 1906, the functional point of view seemed to have almost completely won out. So much so that psychology's older and almost consecrated terms were about finished. Buckner awaited the framing of a new vocabulary of psychology for the new 20th century. The leading functionalist was James Roland Engel, born 1869, died 1949. Born 1869 and died in 1949. James Roland Engel had studied with John Dewey as an undergraduate. In 1908, Engel published an introductory textbook, Psychology, written from the functional standpoint. For Engel, functional psychology was more important than structural psychology. Unlike bodily organs, the structuralist alleged mental elements were not permanent, enduring objects but existed only as the moment of perception. That is, the functions produce the structures, the reverse of biology, in which a given organ performs a distinct function that would not exist without it. Engel also alleged that structural psychology was socially pointless and biologically irrelevant. It studied consciousness removed from life conditions and could therefore tell us nothing useful about how mind works in the real world. Moreover, structuralist reductionism made of consciousness an irrelevant epiphenomenon. Functional psychology, in contrast, reveals consciousness to be an efficient agent in the furtherance of the life activities of the organism. That is, as biologically useful and quite in accord, as Titchener himself had said, with common sense. In his 1906 APA presidential address, The Province of Functional Psychology, Engel directly replied to Titchener's postulates of a structural psychology. Engel's address was a milestone on the road to behaviorism. Engel conceded at the outset that functional psychology was little more than a program and a protest against the sterilities of structural psychology. But then he went on to suggest that structural psychology was a historical aberration, a brief philosophical interlude in the development of scientific, biologically oriented theories of the mind. Functional psychology only appeared new when contrasted with the introspective content psychologies of the first German laboratories. In fact, functional psychology was the true heir to psychology's past, being the fruit of an ancient line of descent running from Aristotle through Spencer, Darwin, and pragmatism. Engel repeated the familiar distinction. Structural psychology was concerned with mental contents, functionalism with mental operations. Functionalism studies mental process as it is in the actual life of an organism. Structuralism studies how mind appears in a merely post-mortem analysis. To this end, modern investigations dispense with the usual direct form of introspection and concern themselves with the determination of what work is accomplished and what the conditions are under which it is achieved. Engel here acknowledged the trend we earlier found in his and others' research and defined the point of view of behavioralist experimentation. He justified this new research emphasis by quite correctly asserting that unlike physical organs dissected by the anatomist, mental contents are evanescent and fleeting. What endures over time are mental functions. Contents come and go, but attention, memory, judgment, the mental faculties of the old psychology rehabilitated, persist. Functional psychology also brought a change in psychology's institutional relationships. Engel said, structural psychology grew out of philosophy and remained closely allied to it. In contrast, functional psychology brings the psychologist cheek by jowl with the general biologist, because both study the sum total of an organism's organic activities, the psychologist concentrating on the accommodatory service of consciousness. Engel's alliance with biology was not Wundt's. Wundt, following the ancient pre-Darwinian path through psychology, linked the study of the mind to the study of the brain. Engel, more thoroughly influenced by Darwin than even James had been, linked the study of the mind to evolutionary biology, not to neurophysiology. The key idea for functionalists was viewing consciousness as an organ serving its bearer's adaptive interests. How consciousness operated at the level of brain mechanisms was less important than how it operated at the level of adaptive behavior. This new biological orientation promised practical benefits as well. Engel averred, pedagogy and mental hygiene await the quickening and guiding counsel of functional psychology. Animal psychology, the most pregnant movement of our generation, finds its rejuvenation in the new movement because it is becoming experimental, wherever possible, and conservatively non-anthropomorphic. Trends we will examine in Chapter 11. Genetic psychology and abnormal psychology, the former barely mentioned and the latter completely ignored by Titchener, would likewise be inspired by a functional approach. Engel endorsed the views set forth by Baldwin that consciousness supervenes on certain occasions in the life of an organism, describing the adjustment theory as the position now held by all psychologists of repute. But he went further than Baldwin or Bolton in claiming that consciousness is no indispensable feature of the accommodatory process. Although in a footnote, Engel still held that accommodation to the novel is the field of conscious activity. He has taken a further step toward behaviorism by suggesting that learning can take place without conscious intervention. Functional psychology was functional in three senses. First, it considered mind to have a distinct biological function selected by Darwinian evolution. It adapts its organism to novel circumstances. Second, it described consciousness as itself a result of the physiological functioning of the organism. Mind, in this view, is itself a biological function. Third, functional psychology promised to be socially useful in improving education, mental hygiene, and abnormal states. Psychology will become functional to 20th century life. In 1906, Engel stood at a hinge in the development of modern psychology. His continued concern with consciousness, however, still linked functional psychology with the mentalism of the past. But at the same time, his emphasis on biology, on adaptation, and on applied psychology marks functional psychology as a new old movement whose time will someday pass to some worthier successor to fill its place. By 1907, then, functional psychology had by and large replaced structural psychology as the dominant approach to the field. However, it never became more than a program and a protest. It was too inconsistent to survive, clinging to a definition of psychology as a study of consciousness, while at the same time putting forth theories of perception and learning that made consciousness less and less necessary as a concept for scientific psychology. Functional theory embodied very clearly the historical forces of the time, pushing psychology toward the study of behavior, and it helped psychologists change their fundamental conceptions of their profession without quite realizing that they were doing anything extraordinary. Continuing here, functional psychology in Europe. Although functional psychology was strongest in America, psychologies that could be identified with functionalism also arose in Europe. Brentano's psychology, because it was labeled as an act of psychology, was often assimilated into the functional worldview. Similarly, the Wurzburg School and the students of memory could be called functional because of their concern with and investigations of mental processes. In Britain, home of modern evolutionism, functional psychology found its William James in James Ward, born 1843 and died in 1925, sometimes called the father of modern British psychology. He was for a time a minister, but after a crisis of faith turned first to physiology, then psychology, and finally philosophy, exactly as James had done. His influence on British psychology came from his article on psychology in the Encyclopaedia Britannica's 9th edition in 1886. It was the first article by that name in the encyclopedia, and Ward reworked it later into a text. Ward settled at Cambridge University, where he was active in attempts to establish a psychological laboratory. Like James, Ward rejected atomistic analysis of the continuum of consciousness. Instead of a sensationistic atomism, Ward advocated a functional view of consciousness, the brain and the whole organism. Ward wrote, "Functionally regarded, the organism is from first to last a continuous whole. The growing complexity of psychical life is only parodied by treating it as mental chemistry." To Ward, perception was not the passive reception of sensation, but the active grasping of the environment. In a Jamesian passage, Ward wrote that not mere receptivity, but creative or selective activity is the essence of subjective reality. He struck a Darwinian note when he said, "Psychology regarded, then, the sole function of perception and intellection Psychology regarded, then, the sole function of perception and intellection is, it is contended, to guide action and subserve volition, more generally to promote self-conservation and betterment. Ward expounded the same kind of pragmatic or functional psychology that James did. For both men, consciousness is an active, choosing entity that adjusts the organism to the environment and so serves the struggle for survival. Ward resembled James in one more way. His fin de siècle concern was with defending religion against the rising tide of Huxleyan naturalism. Ward devoted his last great works to the refutation of naturalism and the support of Christianity. Ward's influence endured for many years in English psychology. Britain retained a functionalist psychology that provided an orienting point for later cognitive psychology. Ward's anti-atomism also endured, to be picked up by later associationists. The Cambridge psychologist Frederick Bartlett, born 1887 and died in 1969, for example, explicitly rejected the attempt to study memory as the acquisition of discrete bits of information, such as the nonsense syllables used in most memory experiments. Instead, Bartlett studied memory of everyday paragraphs. He argued that prose is not a set of atomistic ideas, but rather an embodiment of a large meaning, which he called a schema. Bartlett showed, for example, that different cultures possess different schemas for organizing their experience, and that, consequently, systematic distortions are introduced into one culture's members' memory of another culture's stories. Rethinking the Mind, the Consciousness Debate from 1904 to 1912. Mind's place in nature was being fundamentally revised by functional psychologists and by their colleagues in animal psychology. Mind was becoming problematic, becoming increasingly identified with adaptive behavior itself in functional psychology, and slowly disappearing altogether in animal psychology. In 1904, philosophers too began to re-examine consciousness. So, onto radical empiricism. Does consciousness exist? Pragmatism was a method for finding truths to live by, not a substantive philosophical position. Having left psychology for philosophy, William James turned to the problems of metaphysics and worked out a system he called a radical empiricism. He launched his enterprise in 1904 with a paper boldly titled, "Does Consciousness Exist?" As always, James was provocative and set off a debate among philosophers and psychologists that reshaped their conception of mind. He challenged the existence of consciousness as a leftover artifact of Cartesian dualism, grown ever more attenuated by the advance of science and the compromises of philosophy. I believe that consciousness, when once it has evaporated to this estate of pure diaphanity, ooh, that's one. That's one of them ones. Diaphanity. We got to look that up. Diaphanity. Materials property allowing light to pass through, ranging. Okay. Hold on, wait. All right, I'm going to put this in the chat. Yeah. All right. Diaphanity, or transparency, is a material's property of allowing light to pass through. Okay. Anyway, let's read that again. So, pragmatism was a method for finding truths to live by, not a substantive philosophical position. Having left psychology for philosophy, William James turned to the problems of metaphysics and worked out a system he called radical empiricism. He launched his enterprise in 1904 with a paper boldly titled, "Does Consciousness Exist?" As always, James was provocative and set off debate among philosophers and psychologists that reshaped the conceptions of mind. He challenged the existence of consciousness as a leftover artifact of Cartesian dualism, grown ever more attenuated by the advance of science and the compromise of philosophy. I believe that consciousness, when once it has evaporated to this estate of pure transparency, is on the point of disappearing altogether. It is the name of a non-entity and has no right to a place among first principles. Those who still cling to it are clinging to a mere echo, the faint rumor left behind by the disappearing soul upon the air of philosophy. For 20 years past, I have mistrusted consciousness as an entity. For 7 or 8 years past, I have suggested its non-existence to my students and tried to give them its pragmatic equivalence in realities of experience. It seems to me that the hour is ripe for it to be openly and universally discarded. To deny plumly that consciousness exists seems so absurd on the face of it, for undeniably thoughts do exist, that I fear some readers will follow me no farther. Let me then immediately explain that I mean only to deny that the word stands for an entity, but to insist most emphatically that it does not stand for a function. That function is knowing. James pounced on Descartes' mistaken conclusion from his cogito ergo sum argument. Descartes has concluded that he was a thing, a soul that thinks, when he had only proved that conscious processes exist. Picking up from this, James argued that consciousness does not exist as a distinct, separate thing apart from experience. There simply is experience, hardness, redness, tones, tastes, smells. There is nothing above and beyond it called consciousness or soul that possesses it and knows it. Pure experience is the stuff of which the world is made, James held. Rather than being a thing, consciousness is a function, a certain kind of relationship among portions of pure experience. James's position is complex and difficult to grasp, involving a novel form of idealism. Experience is the stuff of reality, and panpsychism. Everything in the world, even a rock, is conscious. For psychology, what was important was the debate James began, because out of it arose two new conceptions of consciousness that supported behavioralism: the relational theory of consciousness and the functional theory of consciousness. The relational theory of consciousness, neo-realism. To some extent, the important place of consciousness in psychology and philosophy derived from the Cartesian ways of ideas, the copy theory of knowledge. The copy theory asserts, as James puts it, a radical dualism of object and knower. For the copy theory, consciousness contains representations of the world and knows the world only through the representations. It follows then that consciousness is a mental world of representations separate from the physical world of things. In this traditional definition of psychology, the science of psychology studied the world of representations with the special method of introspection, whereas natural sciences such as physics studied the world of objects constructed by observation. James's challenge to the copy theory inspired a group of young American philosophers to propose a new form of perceptual realism at about the same time the Gestalt psychologists were reviving realism in Germany. They called themselves neo-realists, asserting that there is a world of physical objects that we know directly, without the mediation of internal representations. Now, although this theory is epistemological in aim, asserting the knowability of a real external physical world, it carries interesting implications for psychology. For in this realist view, consciousness is not a special inner world to be reported on by introspection. Rather, consciousness is a relationship between self and world, the relationship of knowing. This was the basic idea of the relational theory of consciousness, and it was developed in the years by Ralph Barton Perry, who lived from 1876 to 1957. Damn. James's biographer and teacher, E.C. Tolman, by Edwin Bissell Holt, who lived from 1863 to 1946, with Perry at Harvard, and Munsterberg's successor as Harvard's experimental psychologist, and by Edgar Singer, born 1863 and died in 1954. whose papers on mind anticipated the more influential views of Gilbert Ryle. The mind and the mind without. The mind within and the mind without. The development of the mind within and the mind without. The development of the neo-realist theory of mind began with Perry's analysis of the allegedly privileged nature of introspection. Since Descartes, philosophers had supposed that consciousness was a private, inward possession of representations, known only to itself. Upon this idea, much of Descartes' radical dualism of world and mind rested. In the traditional view, introspection was a special sort of observation of a special place, quite different from the usual sort of observation of external objects. Traditional mentalistic psychology accepted the radical dualism of mind and object and enshrined introspection as the observational technique peculiar to the study of consciousness. Perry argued that introspection was special only in trivial ways, and that the mind within of introspection was in no essential way different from the mind without exhibited in everyday behavior. Asking me to introspect is certainly an easy way to enter my mind, Perry conceded. Only I have my memories, and only I know to what I am attending at any given moment. But in these instances, introspection is not specially privileged, nor is mind a private place. What I experienced in the past could, in principle, be determined by other observers present when memories were laid down. Careful observation of my current behavior will reveal to what I am paying attention. In short, contents of consciousness are not exclusively my own. Anyone can discover them. Indeed, such is the method of animal psychology, said Perry. We discover animal mind by attending to animal behavior, reading an animal's intentions and mental content by observing the way it behaves toward objects in its environment. Another kind of knowledge that seems to make self-consciousness and introspection special sources of knowledge is knowledge of the states of one's own body. Clearly, no one else has my headache. Of course, in this sense, introspection is privileged, but Perry refused to see any momentous conclusion to be drawn from this circumstance. In the first place, although one does not have direct awareness of another's inner bodily states, one can easily know about them from one's own analogous states. Though you do not have my headache, you do know what a headache is. Second, inner bodily processes could be better known by a properly equipped outsider. Who is so familiar with farming as the farmer? Perry asked. Obviously no one, but nonetheless a scientifically trained expert may be able to tell the farmer how to farm more efficiently. Similarly, inner bodily processes are not one's exclusive possession, being open to physiological study. Finally, to assert special introspective access to bodily states is a very trivial defense of introspective psychology, because such contents are hardly the essence of mind. Perry implied that mentalistic psychology was misguided. Consciousness is not a private thing, known only to myself and the shareable only through introspection. Rather, my consciousness is a collection of sensations derived from the external world or from my own body. With James, Perry maintained that there is no entity of consciousness apart from experienced sensations. But because these sensations may be known by anyone else, my mind is, in fact, an open book, a public object open to scientific study. Introspection remains pragmatically useful, of course, for no one has as convenient access to my sensations, past and present, as I have. So the psychologist who wishes to open my mind should simply ask me to look within and report what I find. In Perry's view, however, introspection is not the only road to the mind, because mind is always on view as behavior. In principle, then, psychology can be conducted as a purely behavioral enterprise, engaging its subject's self-awareness when expedient, but otherwise attending only to behavior. Perry's philosophical analysis of mind coincides ultimately with the view being developed in animal psychology. Mind and behavior are functionally the same, and both animal and human psychology rest on the same basis, the study of behavior. All right, so we're on page 320. We have 5 more pages to go. We're going to take a quick, short break so that we can rest up a bit. Actually, we only have 4 more pages to go. We're going to take a quick break, okay, because we've been going at it hard. Okay, we've been going at it very hard. We're going to pick up here on page 320, mind as directed behavior, just like 10 minutes to chill, relax, and then we're going to come back. All right? And we're back. This is part 3, the final part of episode 21 of our 17th book in our Book to React series, A History of Psychology. Been reading quite a lot from chapter 10. My God, chapter 10 has been a behemoth, a full-on beast. But we are almost at the end. We're on page 320, Establishing American Psychology. And we're about to jump into the part where they're talking about functionalism, structuralism, stuff like that. Basically, the debates over consciousness. Yeah, there's only about 4 more pages left in chapter 10. We're going to wrap it up here. Mind as directed behavior. Let's go. Perry claimed that anyone's consciousness could be known by a sufficiently well-informed outside observer. E.B. Holt took consciousness out of a person's head and put it in the environment with his theory of specific response. Holt argued that the contents of consciousness were just a cross-section of the objects of the universe, past or present, distant or near, to which a person is responding. Holt offered an analogy. Consciousness is like a flashlight's beam in a darkened room, revealing the thing we see while leaving others in the dark. Similarly, at any given moment, we are reacting only to some of the objects in the universe, and these are the ones of which we are conscious. So consciousness is not inside a person at all, but is out there wherever the things specifically responded to are. Even memory was treated the same way. Memory is not the recovery of some past idea stored away and recalled, but is simply the presentation before consciousness of an absent object. Holt's view, like Perry's, rejected the alleged privacy of mind. If consciousness is no more than specific response, and its contents no more than an inventory of the objects controlling my current behavior, then anyone who turns the flashlights of consciousness on the same objects as mine will know my mind. Behavior, Holt argued, is always controlled by or directed toward some real object, that is, a goal. And behavior is to be explained by discovering the acted toward objects. So too do psychology. We need not ask our subjects to introspect, though of course we may. We can understand their minds by examining their behavior and the circumstances in which it occurs, abandoning mentalistic for behavioristic psychology. Objects to which an organism reacts are those of which he is conscious, said Holt. Hence, the study of consciousness and the study of behavior were essentially the same. Mind as reification. Although he was not formally a neo-realist, E.A. Singer proposed a behavioral concept of mind, consistent with Perry's and Holt's. Singer applied the pragmatic test of truth to the problem of other minds. Does it matter or does it make a difference to our conduct whether or not other people have conscious experience or not? Singer argued that pragmatically the other mind's problem is meaningless because it cannot be resolved. It had been debated by philosophers and psychologists since Descartes with no sign of progress. Singer concluded that it was a pseudo-problem incapable of solution. Singer considered a possible pragmatic objection that consciousness in others does deeply matter to our everyday behaviors, being what James called a live question. In Pragmatism, published in 1907, James asked us to consider an automatic sweetheart. Suppose you are deeply in love. Every adoring glance, every gentle caress, every tender sigh you will take as signs of your sweetheart's love for you. Everything she does will bespeak a love for you like yours for her. Then one day you discover she is only a machine, cleverly constructed to exhibit tokens of love for you, but she is not conscious being but a machine, a simulacrum of a sweetheart. Do you love her still? James thought one could not. The vital James thought one could not. That vital to love is not just the glances, caresses, and sighs, but the conviction that behind them is a mental state called love, a subjective condition of fondness, affection, and commitment like one's own. In short, belief in other minds passes the pragmatic test, James concluded, for we will feel very differently about, and of course act very differently toward, a creature depending on whether or not we think it possesses a mind. Singer tried to refute James's argument. He asked how terms such as mind or soulless are used in practice. They are inferences from behaviors, constructions we erect out of another's conduct. Of course, these constructions may be wrong, and we discover our error when our expectations about a person's behavior are not fulfilled. In the case of the automatic sweetheart, Singer argued, discovering that she is soulless only means that you now fear that her behavior in the future will not be like her behavior in the past. You fall out of love with her, not because she is mindless, but because you no longer can predict how she will act. Singer argued that the concept of mind is an example of the fallacy of reification, what Ryle later called a category mistake. We believe in an entity called consciousness only because of our tendency to think that if we can name something, it exists. Singer drew an analogy between the concept of mind and pre-scientific theories of heat. Before the development of the atomic theory of matter, if an object was heated by fire, it was said to absorb an invisible fluid called caloric. Thus, a hot rock was a dualistic entity, stone plus heat. However, modern atomic physics says that heat is not a fluid but a state of molecular activity. As an object is heated, its atomic constituents move more violently, and this activity alerts the object's appearance and behavior. There is no caloric fluid. Cartesian and religious dualism, said Singer, were like pre-scientific physics, holding that a human being is a behaving body plus an inhibiting soul. Singer concluded consciousness is not something inferred from behavior. It is behavior. Or more accurately, our belief in consciousness is an expectation of probable behavior based on observations of actual behavior, a belief to be confirmed or refuted by more observation. In Singer's view, then, there is no mind for anyone to investigate. Mentalistic psychology was a delusion from the start. Psychology should abandon mind then and study what is real, behavior. Singer's reply to James's thought experiment of the automatic sweetheart is more important now than it was then, for we can build machines that appear to think, as James's automatic sweetheart appeared to love. Do they really think? And James's own creation has been brought to life in the writings of science fiction novelists. Can a machine, an android, love? For example, the movie Ex Machina. In our age of computers and genetic engineering, these are not ideal questions, and we shall meet them again in the new field of cognitive science. Neorealism did not last long as a philosophical movement. Its primary failing was epistemological, accounting for the problem of error. If we know objects directly and without mediation by ideas, how is it that we have mistaken perceptions? With the copy theory, error is easy to explain by saying that copies may not be accurate. Realism finds error difficult to account for. Realism did, however, have a lasting influence. The neo-realists professionalized philosophy. The older generations of philosophers, such as James, wrote for a wide audience of interested readers, and their names were well known to educated Americans. The neo-realists, however, modeled their philosophy after science, making it technical and inaccessible to non-philosophers. In psychology, their relational theory of consciousness aided the development of behavioralism and behaviorism by reworking the mentalistic concept of consciousness into something knowable from behavior, and perhaps even something identical with behavior, in which case the concept of mind need play no role in scientific psychology, however important it might remain outside the profession. The functional theory of consciousness, instrumentalism. The neo-realists developed the relational conception of mind suggested by James. Dewey and his followers developed the functional conception. Dewey's emerging philosophy was called instrumentalism because of his emphasis on mind as an effective actor in the world and on knowledge as an instrument for first understanding and then changing the world. Dewey's conception of mind was thus more active than the neo-realist, who still adhered to what Dewey called the spectator theory of mind. Copy theories are spectator theories because the world impresses itself, to use Hume's term, on a passive mind, which then simply copies the impression over into an idea. Although the neo-realists rejected the copy theory, they had not, in Dewey's view, gotten away from the spectator theory because in the relational theory, consciousness is still fully determined by the objects to which one is responding. So mind is still a spectator passively viewing the world, only directly rather than through the spectacles of ideas. All right, continuing here. Dewey got rid of the spectator theory, but retained a representational theory of mind. He described mind as a function of the biological organism, adapting actively to the environment, a view going back to the 1896 Reflex Arc paper. As he developed his instrumentalism, Dewey became more specific about what mind actually does. Mind, he proposed, is the presence and operations of meanings, ideas, or, more specifically, the ability to anticipate future consequences and to respond to them as stimuli to present behavior. So mind is a set of representations of the world that function instrumentally to adaptively guide the organism in its dealings with its environment. Echoing Brettano, Dewey claimed that what makes something mental rather than physical is that it points to something else. That is, it has meaning. Postulation of meanings does not require postulation of a separate realm of mind. For ideas are to be conceived as neurophysiological functions, whose total functioning we conveniently designate mind. Dewey also stressed the social nature of mind, even at times coming to deny that animals had minds, a change from his 1896 paper. Dewey was impressed by Watson's claim that thinking is just speech, or more strongly, that vocalization is all thinking consists of, whether such vocalization is out loud or covert. Interestingly, this returned Dewey to Descartes' old view, seemingly rejected by functional psychologists, that animals do not think because they do not talk. Dewey reversed Descartes' priorities, though. For Descartes, thinking comes first and is only expressed in speech. For Dewey, learning to speak creates the ability to think. Descartes was an individualist, investing each human with an innately given self-consciousness endowed with thought, but forever isolated from other consciousness. Dewey was, generally speaking, a socialist. Humans do not possess some a priori consciousness because language, speech, is acquired through social interaction. It follows that thinking, perhaps of all mind, is a social construction rather than a private possession. When we think inwardly, we just talk to ourselves silently rather than out loud, using our socially given speech reactions to adjust to changing circumstances. Dewey, the philosopher of progressivism, also aimed at reconstructing philosophy and society on social basis, breaking down individualism and substituting it for group consciousness, and submerging of the individual into the greater whole. By conceiving of mind as a social construction, the Cartesian privacy of the individual mind was erased. Instead, the truly mindful entity was society itself, the large organism of which each person was a cooperative part. Establishing American psychology, the new psychology and the old. In the United States, experimental psychology was called the new psychology, to distinguish it from the old psychology of the Scottish common sense realist. The great majority of American colleges were controlled by Protestant denominations, and in the 1820s, the Scottish system was installed as a safeguard against what religious leaders took to be the skeptical and atheistic tendencies of British empiricism as described by Reid. The works of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and later the German idealists, were banished from the classroom and replaced with texts by Reid, Dugald, Stewart, and their American followers. Common sense psychology was taught as a pillar of religion and Christian behavior. For the American followers of the Scots, psychology is the science of the soul, and its method, ordinary introspection, reveals the soul as an emanation from the divine and as made in the image of God. Mental science or psychology will therefore be foundational for moral science. The province of psychology will be to show that the faculties are that of moral philosophy, to show how they should be used for the attainment of their end. Unsurprisingly, with few exceptions, adherents of the old psychology looked askance at the new psychology. Askance, what is that? Never heard of this word. Askance. Askance? They looked askance, maybe? With attitude or look of suspicion or disapproval. Okay. Askance. Interesting. Never seen that. Okay. All right. Askance. Adverb. Okay. Anyway, they looked disapprovingly at the new psychology, which brought the mind into the laboratory and investigated the connection of mental states to nervous processes. Nevertheless, as higher education became more secular after the Civil War, the intellectual tide turned in favor of the naturalism of the new psychology. In 1875, William James established an informal psychological laboratory at Harvard in connection with the graduate course, The Relations Between Physiology and Psychology, in the Department of Natural History. In 1887, he began to offer a course called Psychology in the Philosophy Department. In 1885, he had obtained recognition and funds from Harvard and had established the first official psychology laboratory in America. At Yale, the old psychology of the president, Noah Porter, yielded to George Trumbull Ladd, who, through a congressionalist minister and a psychological conservative, respected Wundt's experimental psychology and incorporated it into an influential text, Elements of Physiological Psychology. At Princeton, the president, James McCosh, was a staunch Scot, but recognized that the tendency of the day is certainly towards physiology, and taught Wundt's psychology to his students. Harvard minted its first PhD philosopher, G. Stanley Hall, who lived from 1844 to 1924, in 1878. A student of James, Hall was really a psychologist. He went to Johns Hopkins University, the United States' first graduate university, where he established a laboratory and series of courses in the new psychology. Hall's psychology went well beyond Wundt, however, including in typically American eclectic fashion, experimental studies of the higher mental processes, anthropology and abnormal psychology, or morbid phenomenon. Hall also vigorously pursued developmental psychology, launched the child study movement, and coined the term adolescence. Hall led the institutionalization of American psychology. He started the American Journal of Psychology in 1887 and organized the founding of the APA in 1892. One of Hall's students was James McKean Cattell, born 1860 and died in 1944. Who later studied with Wundt and Galton and then returned to the United States to establish laboratories at the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia University. When Cattell was in Leipzig, he proposed to study individual differences in reaction time, but Wundt disapprovingly called the subject ganz Amerikanisch, typically American. Okay. It has been said that although Rome conquered Greece militarily, Rome was in turn captured by Greek culture. Much the same can be said about German experimental psychology in America. On the battlefields of academe, the new psychology conquered the old, turning psychology into naturalistic, objective science. However, the spirit of the old psychology profoundly transformed the new psychology away from narrow laboratory experimentation on sensation and perception to socially useful studies of the whole person. The Scots and their American followers had always emphasized mind in use, mental activity, more than mental content. Their faculty psychology was, like Aristotle's, implicitly a psychology of function. And, as Aristotle's was a biological psychology, the Scots psychology of mental function, despite its religious connection, was ultimately compatible with modern Darwinian biology. Experiment was new in American psychology, but American psychologists have retained to the present day the Scots' concern with mental activity and with making psychology serviceable to society and the individual. Last page. To the future. Perception and thinking are only there for behavior's sake. In 1892, psychology in America was well launched. In Europe, scientific psychology was making but slow headway, even in Germany, the country of its birth. In the United States, by contrast, psychology expanded rapidly. In 1892, there were 14 laboratories, including one as far away as Kansas. Half of them had been founded independently of philosophy or any other discipline. Psychology would soon be what it largely remains, an American science. But psychology in America would not be the traditional psychology of consciousness. Once psychology met evolution, the tendency to study behavior instead of consciousness became overwhelming. Traditionally, philosophers had been concerned with human knowledge, with how we form ideas and how we know they are true or false. Action resulting from ideas formed only a tiny part of their concern. However, in a biological evolutionary context, ideas matter only if they lead to effective action. The Metaphysical Club realized this and created the pragmatic maxim: the struggle for existence is won by successful action, and any organism, sicklied or with the pale cast of thought, no matter how profound, is doomed to failure. The essence of the psychology of adaptation was the idea that mind matters to evolutionary success because it leads to successful action, and so is adaptive. As James said, if it ever should happen that thought led to no active measures, it would fail of its essential function and would have to be considered either pathological or abortive. The current of life which runs in at our eyes or ears is meant to run out at our hands, feet, or lips. Perception and thinking are only for behavior's sake. The psychology of adaptation, from Spencer to James, remained nevertheless the science of mental life, not the science of behavior. However, much consciousness was tied up with behavior, no matter that it was merely a way station between stimulus and response. It was real and deserved serious study because it was a vital way station. James said consciousness decreed survival. It commanded the body to behave adaptively. Underneath the main current of mentalism, however, ran an undercurrent that headed toward the study of behavior instead of the study of consciousness. And in time, the undercurrent became the main current and finally a flood tide, virtually erasing the science of mental life. Quite a tragedy, quite a tragedy. America came and stomped the buildings. That's the end of part 4. Oh my God, what a read. Jesus Christ. We're going to start part 5 tomorrow, Psychological Science in the Modern World. If you enjoyed this, I hope you did. Let me know what you think in the comments section. We're going to pick up with chapter 11 tomorrow. It's quite a long chapter too. Chapter 11 is, how many pages? 327 to 375. Yeah, I'm going to try to read it all tomorrow, but that's quite a lot. 327, let's do the math right here. All right, hold on. 375 minus 327, that's 48 pages, divided by 2, that's 24. Oh, 24 in 2 shots. We might do it all tomorrow, man. Might break it down. Might leave the stream running. I don't know what might happen, but hopefully you enjoy this live stream. I will catch y'all tomorrow, and peace.